Hello and welcome to Radical Engagements here at Varn. And we return to Mara Van Der Lugt and her defenses of pessimism with an Aeon article from 2022 called Look on the Dark Side. I think this is a good discussion of the history of pessimism, why I actually oppose overly optimistic views of pretty much everything. I am some way an optimist about the world people can create, but not an optimist about the world they do create. And we'll get into that. But we're going to go through the history of philosophy, and I'm going to talk about one of the first pieces of philosophical literature I ever read when I was 15 years old as a freshman in high school. My mom had just started going to college, and she was a freshman in college, actually. And she brought home a signet classic of Candide by Voltaire. And I read it as a ninth grader. I had no idea who Leibniz was and what the stakes were and the auto de fe and Portugal and all that stuff. But it was a hilarious book. I mean, it was a darkly funny book about human nature, which was mostly pessimistic. Despite the philosoph's general optimism, Voltaire kind of thought Leibniz was a jackass. And frankly, to some degree, so did I. Let's get into this article. You can find it on Aeon. In the 17th and 18th centuries, a group of Western philosophers came to clashes, on the page at least, over the age-old problem of evil. The question of how a good God could allow the existence of evil and suffering in the world. Philosophers such as Pierre Bell, Nicolas Malebranche, and G.W. Leibniz, later followed by such pillars of the canon as Voltaire, David Hume, and Immanuel Kant, vehemently disagreed not only about how the problem could be solved, if it could be solved at all, but how to speak to such dark matters. Some of these arguments of theodicy, attempts to justify creation, that's what it formally means, although it's almost always about the justification of the problem of evil, right, in Christian theology, may seem antiquarian to modernize. But in an age where young people question the morality of bringing new children into the world, they are surprisingly relevant. After all, the issue is not just about God, it is about creation, and more specifically, to what extent to which creation can be justified given its ills or evils that are in the world. There are really pessimistic answers to this. This is Varn talking, such as David Benatar's pretty much not just anti-natalism, anti-lifism, which is based on a weird reading of utilitarianism that I think is actually fairly logically consistent. But nonetheless, the question of creation is urgent for us today. Well, I mean, we wouldn't frame it in terms of creation, but the question of materiality is urgent for us today. Considering the great uncertainties of the climate crisis, is it justified to create new people, not knowing what kinds of future lies ahead of them? Now, that's always true, and I'm not an anti-natalist. I'm not really a pro-natalist either. I tend to think these things sort of work themselves out. And if it is justified, is there any point at which it ceases to be? Now, that's a good question. Most people would probably agree that some worlds are imaginable in which creation would be immoral. At what precise point is life too bad or too uncertain to pass on? See David Benatar again. In the early Enlightenment, of course, there were no such concerns for the future of the planet. But there were evils in existence, plenty of them. See Susan Nyman's book on evil and modernity, which also talks about a lot of this stuff in this time period. It's a good book. Crimes, misfortunes, death, disease, earthquakes, and the sheer vicissitudes of life. Considering such evils, these philosophers ask, could existence still be justified? I remember early modern period was very violent. The spread of print literature also led to the spread of popular persecutions and hysteria, such as the purging of witches, hanging mostly, not burning. And it wasn't medieval, and it often wasn't even the church formally doing it. And it was more common in Protestant countries than Catholic ones. But nonetheless, it was a huge thing in the early modern period. And when we talk about the early modern period, we kind of mean the period of the transition out of manorialism and feudalism, and we can have a debate about whether or not those are the same things, in Europe, in the beginnings of settler colonialism, also pretty dark, capitalism, bourgeois life, etc. But before the bourgeoisie were really in charge of anything, we're still living in a quasi-medieval world. This long-standing philosophical debate is where we get the terms optimism and pessimism, which are so much used and perhaps overused in our modern culture. Optimism was a phrase coined by the Jesuits for philosophers such as Leibniz, with his notion that we live in the best of all possible worlds. For surely, if God could have created a better one, he would have done so. Which I actually think is a pessimistic outlook, considering some of the stuff that was going on when he was alive, but nonetheless. Pessimism followed not long afterwards to denote philosophers such as Voltaire, whose novel Candide ridiculed Leibnizian optimism by contrasting it with the many evils in the world. And remember, I read Leibniz as a grad student, I think, maybe as an undergrad, but I read Voltaire as a kid, and this book in particular. If there is the best of all possible worlds, Voltaire's hero asked, what on earth are the others like? There are other worlds. But really, Voltaire wasn't much of a pessimist. Other philosophers, such as Bell and Hume, went much further in their demonstrations of the badness of existence. For Bale and for Hume after him, the point is not just that evils of life outnumber the good, though they believe this is the case, but also outweigh them. A life might consist of equal number of good moments and bad moments. The problem is that the bad moments tend to have an intensity that upsets the scales. It's this logic, by the way, that David Benapar applies to utilitarianism to argue not just for antinatalism, but antinatalism applied to all life, not just human life, all life. Because bad outweighs good, see Hume, and therefore should always be weighted higher in the equation. And thus, when you set out to do the equation, the Peter Singer-like equations just don't work, and you should be arguing that there should be no new life brought into the world of any kind, not just human life, again, all life. A small period of badness, says Bale, has a power to ruin a large amount of good, just like a small portion of seawater can salt a barrel of fresh water. Similarly, 1 hour of deep sorrow contains more evil than there is good in 6 or 7 pleasant days. I don't know about that. I mean, I don't know what evil means when you remove it from its theological context, so we'll come back to that. Against this bleak vision, thinkers such as Leibniz and Jean-Jacques Rousseau emphasize the goods of life and the power we have to seek out the good in all things. For if we learn to adjust our vision, we would see that life is in fact very good, that there is, quote, there is an incomparably more good than evil in the life of men, as are incomparably more houses than prisons, Leibniz writes. And the world, quote, will serve us if we use it for our service. We will be happy in it if we wish to be. Just as pessimists believe that the optimists were deceived in their insistence of the goods of life, so to the optimists, all the pessimists' eyes were skewered towards the bad. Each side accused each other of not having the right vision. A large part of the question thus became, what is the right vision? One thing that struck me as I dug deeper into these questions of how concerned both the optimists and the pessimists were the ethical assumptions underlying the theoretical arguments. Yeah, we're not just dealing with theoretical, to make up a word, or are theological arguments. We're also dealing with ethical assumptions undergirding those theoretical and theological arguments. This is why I often tell people, even if you are secular, to take theology seriously, because a lot of secular concepts actually emerge from it. On the surface, the question was, can creation be justified? But beneath it, never far removed, lay a deeper question, a question just as ethically and emotionally imbued: how to speak of suffering in a way that offers hope and consolation. There is not just a theoretical, but also a moral objection that each side makes against the other. The great objection that the pessimists lay at the feet of the optimists is to insist that life is good, even in the face of a hard, unyielding suffering, are to stipulate that we are in control of our happiness, that we shall be happy if we wish to be. That is to make our suffering worse. It blames us. It's basically a kind of victim blaming, according to the pessimistic worldview. To add to suffering the responsibility for that suffering, it is to burden the sufferer with the sense of their own inadequacy. If life is so good, then the sufferer's problem must cease to be of the wrong vision. And indeed, the optimists tend to say things just like that. This is why optimists, so say the pessimists, is a cruel philosophy. If it gains us hope, it fails in consolation. But the other side, the optimists prove to be similarly concerned. Their objection to the pessimists is that if we insist on the intensity and ubiquity and inescapability of suffering, if we describe it in all the depths and bleakness, as pessimists indeed are wont to do, this heaps suffering on suffering, and this makes suffering worse, as evils are doubled by being given an intention that ought to be averted from them, as Leibniz says. Pessimists, so say the optimist, is itself unconsoling, but more than that, it is unhopeful. Dun dun dun. You guys know what I feel about hope that you don't make for yourself. The question concerning these philosophers, then, is not just a theoretical one about whether life in general is good or bad, but a far more concrete one. Face to face with one who suffers, what can philosophy bring to the table? What can philosophy offer in the way of hope and consolation? Or theory, or ethics, not just philosophy in the broad strokes. Politicians are keen to insist that they are optimists, or to speak of the duty of optimism. Yeah. Bleh. Both strands of thought have the same aim, but they plot different routes to get there. The pessimists offer consolation by emphasizing our fragility, but recognizing that no matter how hard we try, we may fail to achieve happiness for no fault of our own. I mean, yeah. In that way, I actually may not be a pessimist, because I do think some of it is people's fault. All right. Meanwhile, the optimist seeks to unfold hope by emphasizing our capacity, by insisting that no matter how dark, how bleak our circumstances, we can change our vision and direction, and we can always aim for better. Of course, there is no reason in principle why both worlds could not be combined. I mean, I think I combine them that way, frankly. I think we can always build better if we realize how dark things are likely to be. All right. Each to serve as a necessary counterpart for the other, an antidote for the poison each draught may become when summed up undiluted, aka when you listen to Stephen Pinker and not Nicholas Taleb. But the fact remains that these earliest optimists and pessimists saw them as opposed. And in fact, we do too. We have a tendency to think in binary terms. Yeah, which is bad. I mean, dialectics are set up in binaries, and I talk about that a lot, but the binary terms often are set up as things that cannot be transcended or moved past, and often we definitely need to. As if there is in life a stark choice between optimism and pessimism. As Noam Chomsky's words for optimism are despair. Yeah, this is one of the stupidest things Chomsky said. I have many problems with Chomsky. This is one of them. We had true choices. We can get pessimistic, give up, and hope ensure that the worst will happen, or we can be optimistic, grasp the opportunities that surely exist, and maybe help make the world a better place. Not much of a choice. Well, Mike Davis would actually answer to you to that you can definitely not give up and be pessimistic. In fact, optimism and pessimism, according to Mike Davis, is beyond the question. Right? And Mike Davis's last work over at Sidecar at New Left Review was pretty fucking bleak. And frankly, I think correct. All right. The last example itself makes manifest the coarseness and one-sidedness of our use of these terms. Optimism tends to be positively charged, pessimism negatively charged. It's kind of a trap. When we call someone an optimist, it's usually a praise. I mean, not when I call it. I usually use it as a term synonymous with fool, but go ahead. This is why politicians are particularly keen to insist that they are optimism or to speak of the duty of optimism. Conversely, to call someone a pessimist is usually to deride, denounce, and deflate them. Pessimism is for losers, as one book title has it. But all our choices so dichotomous. No, they're not that dichotomous. I mean, obviously, they're not that dichotomous. This is a dumb debate. If there are shadows on the road to pessimism, then there are dangers on the opposite road too. And these are the very dangers that the older pessimists kept warning us against. If we overemphasize the power we have over our minds, our lives, our destinies, it all too easily to stumble into cruelty. Example, we blame people for things that are beyond their control, and we apply the survivor's bias to everything. That's my example, but yeah. We do not look very far to see examples of what optimism in its darkest form can become. When a 2008 London tower block named Haygate Estate was sold off to foreign investors, its inhabitants were first evicted, then offered mindfulness course by the local council to deal with their anxiety, so that they were themselves made responsible for their own misfortune. This is one of the things that Barbara Ehrenreich said that was right about over-insisting on optimism. If we are each radically in control of our mental states, what reason is there to ask for social justice? I mean, we'd have to define for social justice in a coherent way that is socially accepted for it to be meaningful, which is part of the problem. Social justice is thrown around to the point that it's almost an empty signifier. But there's truth in that because all justice is social. Seriously. And so if justice has any meaning beyond fairy tales we tell to children, then it would have to be socially defined. This is the shadow side that cleaves the popular narrative that you are responsible for your own happiness, which I both believe and also think is kind of mean. And is bolstered by the subtle terror of social media regime that pushes us to broadcast our successes and happiness to the world. I don't do it. I mean, I do that some, but I don't do it a ton. In such cases, the consoling forces of pessimism reveal itself. It's okay not to be okay. Sometimes we fail. I mean, we fail more than we don't often. Even winners fail a lot. Sometimes we run up against the hard walls of our capacities or the world's boundaries. And it can be consoling to be reminded that our suffering, our fragility, is not our fault. I mean, here's the thing. Parts of it are your fault and parts of it aren't. And that's why I don't like this dichotomy between optimism and pessimism. But if you're going to make me pick, I would be a pessimist of the intellect and a realist of the will. That we suffer despite ourselves. Suffering is inevitable. The only way you deal with suffering is personal. I do not mean that there is no way to do a better world. I'm not telling people to be quietistic, but your psychological suffering is yours. It can be a reasonable response to an insane world, though. I mean, clearly. That it can be right to grieve for what we are losing, or yet to lose, or have already lost. That can be right to grieve for what we are losing, or yet to lose, or already lost. We are so quick to equate pessimism with passivity or fatalism or despair. Yeah, I'm not a fatalist, and I'm not particularly despairing. And one of the most, quote, black pill people I know is one of the happiest. So, you know. And to reject it on that basis, for of course, we do not want a philosophy that tells us to give up. But what pessimism means? For as Joshua Foya Dinstag argued in his book, Pessimism, Philosophy, Ethic, and Spirit, far from leading to passivity, pessimism can be closely linked to a tradition of moral and political activism, as in the case of Albert Camus, whose courage and activism in the Second World War were infused by his pessimistic views. I mean, Camus is someone I grew past, and I have many deep critiques of, but when I was a teenager, I also read him when I was about 14 years old, and when I still called him chemist, and I thought that he was really helpful. Even the darkest pessimist never said that life would only get worse and can never be better. This is a caricature of pessimism, sketched out quickly to dismiss it. Offer Schopenhauer, the bleakest of them all, did not subscribe to it. On the contrary, Schopenhauer is like dark Kantianism, by the way. I don't love neo-Kantianism in any form, but Schopenhauer's dark Kantianism is kind of funny. On the contrary, he suggested that it was precisely because we cannot control the course of things that we can never know what the future holds. Life may become worse or better. I think we can control a lot more of the course than we set out to. I don't want to, that is fatalism, but we can't control all of it. It is too complex to know all the results, and that's something I harp on a lot. The pessimist, in Dinstag's word, expects nothing. There is not much hope in this, perhaps, but there is a kind of hope nevertheless. And so, too, is the faint glimmering that can be found amongst the darkest pages of these writers. The quick, unquiet intuition that something can be gathered in the black vision, that our eyes may be open in ways that were not before, that we may see in the darkness. It is hopeful pessimism may not be a contradiction, but a manifestation of a wild power that is harnessed when life's darkest forces are gathered into a strange alchemy of hope. Meaning that things can change, but one should not always expect them to change in a progressively good way. That's how I interpret it. That's why I talk about revolutionary pessimism. It's not because I believe that all revolutions fail. Clearly they haven't. It's that I think you have to admit you don't really know most of the time when subjective and objective conditions combine for you to do something that truly changes everything else. Or at least you don't know till very close to the moment that it happens. I think that these things in this age marked by ecological depletion and devastation, by floods and fires and heat ceilings that no one had thought possible. Well, people have thought it possible since the 50s, but not in the 19th century. Although Marx did see some bleak stuff coming from capital and the environment. And he wasn't even the only one. But anyway, by the specter of the climate crisis that takes shape all around us. This age is also marked by quiet or not so quiet desperation of the young. It's actually getting louder and fucking louder, guys. I teach the young. They are moving from radical to nihilistic pretty quickly. Anyway. Very fin de cycle 19th century shit, except we're in the beginning of the 21st. The same criticisms which raised against pessimists of yore and now laid at the feet of despairing young by the techno-optimists and advocates of progress, for whom any consideration of the mere possibility of decline is itself a sign of weakness, a lack of imagination, or moral flaw. Yeah, and these people don't understand complexity and they're foolish. But I did read all the discussions of Tainter that I could find, and many of the critics just had an issue with him using the term decline. As if complexity decline was impossible because decline itself is a moral vision, which I think is crazy. A failure vision most of all. And so they denounce young people's outcry as pessimism, as fatalism, as mere despair. But they criticize them for bleakness of their vision, call their statements exaggerated, and the speakers spoiled. Sometimes speakers are spoiled, sometimes the statements are exaggerated, and yet it still could be true in the broad sense. It is all too easy to miss the fact that this generation, the fact the first to grow up in a world where climate emerging is not just on the horizon, but a stark reality. I don't know, my generation is pretty close. And I'm a zennial. It is haunted by the real sense of losing the future, as all things they have been told give meaning to life are rendered either pointless or problematic. Well, Bifo said this way back, the cancellation of the future. Things like study, get a good job, settle down, but what jobs are still certain? Where would it be safe to settle down? As Greta Thunberg said in the Parliament Square in London in 2018, and why should I be studying for a future that soon will be no more when no one is doing anything whatsoever to save that future? Things like start a family, but if there's no future for one's children, is it still okay to procreate? People have procreated during plagues, my friend. Even more trivial things like developing oneself by traveling are no longer straightforward. How important is self-development outrated against the carbon costs of modern travel? Well, I mean, as an individual, it's not that huge. As a collectivity, it is. But you can't solve the individual problem. Well, you can solve the individual problem by still cultivating yourself, but you can't solve the collective problem by just hoping everyone just stops, because some of this stuff is going to happen because of industry no matter what. This wholesale collapse of meaning is now only becoming clear to us. This is a very real sense in which young people are experiencing not only the loss of concepts, but the loss of the future itself, as all the usual answers to the question of what makes life worthwhile become increasingly uncertain. And so they LARP the past. As Marx said in other unstable times that people do, they always wear the play clothes of the past, but sometimes it's more pathetic than others. They're in that darkness, searching for some kind of hope, some kind of consolation. And what can we offer them? Yeah, we don't offer them shit, man. Surely we can do better than give them manifestly inadequate answers, which may also be an outright lie, to assure them that all will be well, and that we know there is every chance that it won't be. I don't ever tell anyone that all will be well. I don't consult cancer patients with that either. When my ex-wife had cancer, she would get sick when people would tell her everything was going to be okay. She survived. I stayed with her for those years, but it wasn't good. It is clear that Greta Thunberg at least will continue to strive, even if her efforts are doomed to fail. Yeah. I think Thomas Morton, kind of liberal Zen Catholic activist who was a big promoter of social justice, said you do things because they are good, even if things get worse. Now, I'm more consequentialist than that, but I do think you do the work regardless, which is why I don't flake out on a lot of this stuff when things get hard or don't go our way, because I never really expected them to be easy. And I know the historical odds of things going anyone's way. Any crude statement of optimism would be more than misplaced. It would be a kind of lie that deceives no one, least of all the sharpened moral senses of the young who see through the empty promises and reassurances of politicians with the anger we know is justified. Although this anger can turn to fear and be conservatizing, this is Varn talking, and we have to deal with that. This is why this doesn't all cut to radicalism at all. If we turn them that everything will be okay, these are less than empty words. Yeah, X will win. Yeah, you say that as aspiration, but it also sometimes feel like you're avoiding the fact that it currently isn't. You don't see me use that language because I don't think it's actually all that motivating. I think it has people sit on their laurels and not do shit because they think they're going to always automatically win. And yet they haven't. In the case of, say, communism, well, we got a long track record on failure there. They are a failure to take their experiences seriously, and that, as the pessimist would tell us, is the one thing agreed to make their suffering worse. If brute optimism fails, can pessimism do better? I have suggested that pessimism can have a value, but can we go further? Could it be in fact a virtue? I'm not sure. This is me talking, and I'm a big virtue thinker. But I'm not totally unconvinced either. Let's see if Dr. Van Der Lugt can finish convincing me. To some, the very notion of a virtue of pessimism seems absurd. For instance, we may subscribe to Hume's notion that the mark of any virtue is that it's useful and agreeable, either to the person who possesses it or to others. I think that's fair. But surely the pessimist is neither useful nor agreeable. Well, I think maybe I would say any virtue is that it is useful. I don't know if agreeable is always useful. I would say social, but I am a very social person who is not agreeable about much of anything. But surely pessimism is neither useful nor agreeable. It is not useful, the argument goes, because it renders us passive, depressed, not only ourselves, but the sense of the possible, as Marilyn Robinson has said of the cultural pessimism in particular. And it is not agreeable, since it intensifies our suffering, makes us focus on the bad side of life rather than the good, or so the arch optimists such as Leibniz and Rousseau would have it. Yeah, fuck those guys. It is not surprising then that a certain studies of supposed moral exemplars identify positivity, hopefulness, and optimism amongst characteristics that such exemplars had in common, asterisk, but almost every study says that the depressed are actually more accurately assessing their world on asterisk. That's not there, but it's definitely something I've studied. But then think of Greta Thunberg. If there's such a thing as climate virtue, she would be seen to exemplify it. Considering the hard personal choices she has made, the steadfastness of her vision, and the courage to which she holds the world leaders to account and takes them to a task for their half-heartedness, their willingness to commit fully to the cause, which she hasn't won, by the way, at all, even though she was a liberal darling for years for doing it. If this is not an exercise of virtues, then I don't know what is, and yet there is nothing positive or optimistic about Thunberg. If there is hope, it's a dark, bleak hope full of rage and grief and pain for what is being lost. Rage and grief and pain is actually important. Don't let those people try to mindfulness train you out of it. Now, yes, I think anger can destroy you. I really do believe that. I mean, this is also a Buddhist thing. But I think the idea that we don't deal with rage, grief, and pain is cowards' mindfulness and idiot compassion. But infused also with insistence, pursuance, determination. If it is clear that this activist, at least, will continue to strive, even if her efforts are doomed to fail, this is not optimism. If anything, it is hopeful pessimism. And I believe it is every right to be called a virtue in our age. You know, I think that is part of Gramsci's point about pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Or Mike Davis's point is you fight the good fight whether you think you're going to win or not. Because sometimes you don't have a choice. Or you do have a choice, but the other choice is being ground to dust. Now, the question is, how do you fight and what risk you're going to take for other people? Those are broader questions. Those are ethical questions. And this question of optimism or pessimism doesn't really solve them at all. Hopeful pessimism breaks through the rusted dichotomy of optimism versus pessimism. It is this attitude, this perspective that exemplified in Thunberg and other figures who, by their example, give an affirmative answer to the question posed by Paul Kingsnorth. Is it possible to see a future as dark and darkening further, to reject false hope and desperate pseudo-optimism without collapsing into despair? Well, I hope one of the lessons of this goddamn channel is yes, it is. I'm not despairing, guys. I don't go to bed as a bummer. I am sometimes too angry, and it's a character flaw. But despair, not my thing. And fatalism, not my thing. I do think we have agency in the world. But to have that agency, you have to admit where you are, where you failed, how bad you failed, etc., and what you don't and cannot know. And that's not just true about political things, that's true about your personal success and failure. Some people ask me for questions and hope that I can't give them, but I can give them hope to make their life better. I just can't give them the hope they want. Should I lie to them or should I tell them the truth? I always, myself, think I should tell them the truth and give them something. Even if it is small, even if it is frustrating, even if it requires a lot of work. The thing is to avoid not so much pessimism, but hopelessness or fatalism or giving up. Even despair need not be completely avoided, since it too can energize and encourage us to strive for change, but we should avoid the kind of despair that causes us to collapse. Yeah, I mean, when we talk about productive versus unproductive stress, maybe we should also talk about productive versus unproductive sadness. These are not the same things as pessimism, which is simply the assumption of a dark view of the present as well as the future, and does not imply the loss of courage or insistence to strive for better. On the contrary, often these are very gifts that the pessimist can bestow. Thank you. One can be deeply, darkly pessimistic, and one can find oneself in the cold, hard clutches of despair, and yet not be depleted of the possibility, and it could just be a possibility, that the better may yet arrive, are asterisks, you may be able to help make the better. That's a better thing to think of. Not just the betterment may arrive, but despite how bad things are, maybe we can do something. Even though we don't know the cost and the contradictions and the complexities that emerge from that. This kind of hope is dearly bought and does not come lightly, but is carved out of a painful vision, which may just be the acknowledgement of all the suffering that life can and does hold. If anything, the pessimists have taught me this, that with eyes full of darkness, there can still be a strange, shadowy openness, like a door cracked open, and for the good to make its entry into life, or just life itself being the light of the world. Since all things are uncertain, so too is the future. And so there is always a possibility of change for better as there is for worse. To be open with eyes with the reality before us requires courage. This itself can be a moral stance, one that welcomes the good when it is given and urges us onward on the journey, but acknowledges the bad without explaining it away or overburdening the will of those it crushes in its path. Sometimes we are not in the power to change the world as we would like to, and acknowledging this can be the greatest effort as well as the greatest consolation, while not taking away the drive to give our best and hardest labors to the cause. We make the world, but not as we would like, which is not what Marx says, but it's pretty damn close. As Jonathan Lear has written in his book Radical Hope, one common phenomenon at times of cultural devastation is that the old values lose their meaning. If they are to survive the collapse of the moral horizon, they need new meanings, new concepts to breathe life into them. The most difficult thing of all is to negotiate this change, to start inhabiting the new virtues as while the old are still among us, to hold them together and simultaneously without just trading them out like everything's progressive or not. I mean, it's such a weird, uncomplicated bullshit way to view the world. And this, I believe, is one of the ways in which pessimism might serve us as a virtue in itself, but also as a way of giving new meaning to virtues that are changing in this as part of this changing world. To behold with open eyes the reality before us requires courage, and not to turn away from it, forbearance, and yet not to decide that it ends there. This is hope. Hope. Not that everything will be all right in the end, but that nothing has ever truly ended. That there is a crack in everything, of which Leonard Cohen once sang, and in good as well as bad, so neither is entirely shut away from us. This is not the steadfast conviction that things are bound to get better. Yeah, they're not bound to get better. Not the crude optimism that can no longer be the virtue in a breaking world and might prove to be our besetting vice. It might be easier to lend our efforts under such a banner of assured success, but this is a deceptive one and a demoralizing one when the assured success never arrives, by the way. And people just scramble to make new theodicies and eschatologies to explain why the failure isn't actually a failure or whatever. And if you don't see this all over the place, your eyes aren't looking very hard. For while it is possible to be dispirited by a passivity or fatalism, it is possible to be depleted by continued disappointment also. What hopeful pessimism asks instead is that we strive for change without certainties, without expecting anything from our efforts other than the knowledge that we might have done what was called upon us moral agents in this time of change. This may be just the thinnest hope, the bleakest consolation, but it also may be the very thing that serve us best in the times to come as a value, and yes, an exercise of moral fervor, a fragile virtue for a fragile age. And I would like to say, all ages are fragile. All pieces are fragile. That's why I always end with protect your peace. It's not just peace. It's not just have peace. It's a call to be active in it because it's hard won psychologically, mentally, socially, physically. It's hard won. Are you willing to do the work? And are you willing to look at the world enough to do that work? Because sometimes the right answer is I don't have one. But we have to do the work to figure out what that answer could be. Good night. Good luck. Don't let this pessimist, this optimist binary be a bullshitting thing in your life. Take care and protect that peace.